All right. Thank you, Mimi, for that wonderful introduction, and a very big thank you to all of you for coming out, especially on such a rainy and gloomy Saturday. I want to, thank Mimi and also Jims and the whole Blindspot team for this opportunity, and also to Jen for inviting me to do this talk. I'm very honored to do this with you, especially since I've been following your career, and given our longstanding friendship from New York. So as Mimi mentioned, this is a occasion of many firsts for Jen. It is your first debut solo exhibition in Blindspot and also in Hong Kong. It is the premiere of your new film, I Am Cloud. And this is also the first time that I think The Land at the Bottom of the Sea is being shown in Hong Kong as well, after being commissioned for the Taipei Biennial in 2023. And I also want to say that it feels a little bit like a full cycle moment or a full circle moment, because you were an artist in residence at Parasite in 2016. So to foreground this talk, it's going to be a half an hour conversation between Jen and I, and then we'll also open it up to the floor for some questions. And as Mimi mentioned, there is a dark room over there where The Land at the Bottom of the Sea is being shown. And that work, Jen, you really begin with the question, what happens if one was liquidated socially, politically, and financially. And it's a very, very watery film. It has a lot of motifs surrounding, the sea, states of water, and through asking about how we, through asking about the state of dissolution, you're also pointing out a history of erasure, particularly of female activists, in the past, and how they're actually dissolved from collective memory. And after that work, you have actually embarked on a very interesting film called I Am Cloud, where I feel like there is this transition between the wateriness that you're sort of bringing out at The Land at the Bottom of the Sea, all the way to, the states of mist, of vaporization. And I just wanted you to talk a little bit about the transitions between the two films, thinking about this wrapping up a significant body of work for you and then embarking on a new one. So I wanted you to ask about, sort of the continuities and the contrast between the two of them.
I think there's a lot of different things. Certainly that contrast between water, and not just water, but like really deep sea immersion and clouds is a really big contrast for sure. But it also has to do with just the moment in my own artistic life. I think it's really quite heavy to actually work on something for, 7 years, but also kind of 8 years or 9 years or 10 years, right? So quite a long time. And I think that I found for myself, as I was working on this body of work year after year, it just got heavier and heavier and heavier. And the cultural, political, and historic load of that body of work just became so much. So at some point it really did have to end. And it did have to end. I know it's sort of in some ways lighthearted, but I really wanted to like rip it apart. And to literally like rip the hands and feet and arms off this body of work and really let it be done. And so this is me stepping into a new body of work here on the right-hand side. And there's a lot that I'm thinking there, but it's really quite light, not only in terms of its materiality, but also because it's still ideas that I'm sorting out. And so I'm just starting to get into it. But right now, I would argue that I'm a little bit on the surface. But being at the surface of multiple positions and or multiple ideas also is giving me kind of gateways for work and ideas to come. I know that sounds very vague, but that's also, the cloud is also somewhat vague.
Yeah, because The Land at the Bottom of the Sea was actually a conclusion to a 7-year project called Pink Slime Caesar Shift. And Pink Slime Caesar Shift was really a project that thought about labor, in particular female labor. And at the land at the bottom of the sea, you're really thinking about activism, labor, and also particularly how that gets eroded by collective memory. And can you talk a little bit about the historical precedent behind that work and why you chose to address this erasure?
Sure. Okay, so I think that I want to go back to this idea of the end of things. In particular, I was thinking about that convergence between the end of a long body of work and the end of, let's say, any number of activist dreams. And what does that mean? And what happens after? And how is it remembered? And who remembers it? And what are the documents that are preserved? Or what documents are destroyed? And so a lot of the piece is very much about exploring the feelings about that. But the piece itself, any kind of end is very mournful, but it's also hopeful, but also for me personally quite cynical. And I think as an artist, it was really important for me to allow myself to think through, well, right, this was many years of my work. What happens after that? What did it all come to, right? Which certainly happens to many artists and to many activists as well. And so it was really important to me that the video become a different kind of object. So yes, it is a media object with a narrative, with actors, quite beautiful imagery, right? And certainly many texts. But it also is an encrypted object, and it has an archive packed inside itself. It is itself an archive. And so to some extent, it was a deep question for me. Well, is it enough to make a video? Is it enough to have a temporary audience? Huh? Or is there more that one can do with whatever is this object? And does it only have to be a singular kind of object? Must a video only be a video, or can it be something for the future? Huh? So.
Yeah, and on that note, I actually wanted to spend a little bit more time thinking about I Am Cloud, because this is your very recent work. And in that work, you really introduced three main characters. There is, and I'm going to get into a couple of technical terms on this front. There is what we call the click worker. There is a xenobot. And then there is also, surprisingly, you end with the introduction of the figure of the 19th century female sex worker in the US. And I kind of wanted to walk the audience through these three different characters that you introduce in turn in I Am Cloud. And I wanted to ask you actually to explain what the click worker is and how they're actually affecting our lives today.
So click workers are data workers. There's an old version of data workers and there's a more contemporary version of data workers. An older version of data workers would be the folks who were given a pile of documents and then were asked to type out everything in the document.
Right. Whereas like the contemporary version of the click worker is actually someone who has to do menial micro data entry tasks such as identifying content and images, like making all these like bounding boxes. Bounding boxes for like bicycles and things like that, and that actually powers like our different industries.
Indeed. Yeah. I mean, there's an idea that somehow AI training is a skilled labor, and to some extent it is. There are definitely trainers at the upper levels, but a lot of the times what it takes to properly train any number of AI models is a lot of sweat equity So it's a lot of people in warehouses, scattered in their bedrooms at home, in crowded living rooms, anywhere that they can get them. And those workers often are working freelance through various platforms, including Amazon Turk, but also Clickworker, which is one I enjoy somehow. And I definitely did my time in some of them, just seeing what was happening, what were the conditions of this work. And this work is, it's extremely, as you can imagine, it's deep.
Tedious.
It's not only is it tedious, it's deeply underregulated. And so it's underpaid to an extent which is shocking. And also, one of the things that's quite infernal about it is if the algorithm finds that your work is not acceptable, you kind of worked for many hours at a time, and then it's not accepted. Right. And then you don't get paid.
Yeah.
Right? But there's no one to blame, and there's no boss. Right? So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that is one labor industry that you're actually thinking about in I Am Cloud. And, you know, then you introduce the second character, and we can really think about this film as like structured in 3 parts. You know, you also introduce this character of the Xenobot, which is an artificial life form that is actually being generated by artificial intelligence, that, you know, kind of occupies this very gray, hazy area between an actual being and a robot, because they're made of biological material. But they're not sentient, and you know they're used in different medical industries, you know, for cleaning up the oceans. Yes, or they hope exactly, they hope. Yeah. And I wanted to ask you this question actually: what made you identify these invisible labor industries? You know, what actually drew you to them? Because they are really, even though they affect our lives so much, and even though, you know, for example, like the click worker really, really affects the algorithms that feeds us the content that we see, right? And it, you know, affects our experience of life, but they're really, really hidden, and they're not, you know, coming out into the forefront of our mind at all, or we're not being made aware of their existence. What made you discover, you know, these industries, and what drew you to them, and why do you want to address them in your practice?
Sure. So I was just really interested in this idea of labor that's not just invisible, but labor that has to efface itself, right? So if you imagine walking through the snow and hunting, I don't know, whatever, I don't know what other kind of analogy this could be, and behind you, you have to sweep your tracks, right? That's the kind of effacing, right? Leave no trace. Leave no trace of yourself, leave no trace that this was worked on, and yet it was worked on by you, right? And so that is the kind of position that I was interested in I Am Cloud. Yeah. And of course, they're very different. But very generally, we could say that something like the click worker, of course, we understand the smoothness of our interfaces and apps. We know, even if we know abstractly that somebody worked on it, we don't know the scale, we don't know the conditions, and we just won't know ever, right? How many hands touch that data. And then with xenobots, well, actually, let's go to the sex workers, right? Chinese American sex workers in the 19th century, female Chinese sex workers. You know, Chinese women were just not allowed into the U.S. for half a century, the first half century that they were in the U.S. And it created a very particular economic model of, I would argue, exploitation, but also, you know, a little bit of black market, I don't know what's the word, like ribaldry, naughtiness, somebody's economic opportunity.
Right, and you know, also this has a lot to do with the history of exclusion, you know, that the United States actually has, because at that point in the 19th century,
Right.
women,
Right.
Asian women were actually not allowed
Yeah.
into the U.S. at that
Yes.
point in time.
Indeed.
Yeah.
But this is the thing, if you make something illegal, it creates another kind of economy really quickly, right? It creates
Right.
another society then that is generated by that economic activity, and that's exactly what happened. And so, but this specter of having to efface that labor, be in as small of a space as possible, as invisible as possible, even while you're doing the most bodily thing, most intimate thing, for fear of not just getting jailed, but also getting deported. And that's very important. And then xenobots, do they have feelings yet? We're not sure. We're not sure. But I am intrigued by this idea of something that can be a medical device, something that can be a military technology, something that can theoretically be a kind of like ecological and environmental savior, and yet have no trace, right? Be largely invisible except for a light haze, right? It's quite strange. So that would be my kind of summary of how they kind of all live up to that idea of effacement.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because I feel like, in a sense, in your work, you're often chasing the shadow of all these invisible labor, and all these industries that are being, effaced. Like, I really love that term of you, saying like you're walking in the snow and like the footsteps kind of get swept away, and that's actually how these industries, like the data industry, the data mining industry, like the medical industry, and a lot of the sex industry. These are industries that are really built on a sense of marginalized, workforces, and I think that's really something that you're trying to point out within, the works itself. I mean, I think another one. I also just wanted to ask you, why do you choose the motif of the cloud? To kind of get at these things that you're trying to explain in I Am Cloud, and the cloud kind of like reappears and appears again and again in your work. Even in your paintings, like you see these sort of like hazy cloud, forms. And I just wanted to ask you a little bit also about how you see the cloud, how it functions as a metaphor, and how you employ it visually within the video, in your paintings, and even in your sculpture work.
That is a very big set of questions, Junni.
Sorry. Yeah. I mean, to break it down, I think it's really interesting if we look at the video how this mist-like haze kind of floats through the video, and it's it follows these characters around, and I think we can actually start there with the video. And why do you choose the cloud as a metaphor, to describe all these industries that you are pointing out to us?
Sure. I mean, I think that we all understand the idea of the cloud today as something in which a lot of things are hidden inside of. It's like the ultimate abstraction device, right, for any number of things. But it obfuscates the connections between people, and it obfuscates economic lines of connection. Also, I would argue political and ethical things as well. So it creates a kind of screen, right, through which it's a traversable, right. You can't get to the other side. You can't see who or what is on the other side. Right, and meanwhile, it presents itself as something quite clean and smooth, but it's a hiding device, right? Who knows what's inside the cloud, right? And I know that is again not specific. What do I like about clouds? What do I like about clouds? I would also say too. This is a really basic thing, actually. I would say that as a child, when way back when my parents would make me go on the many, many trips between New York and Taiwan, which would, at that point, went through Alaska. So like 28, 30 hours. and I was such a little kid on all these flights. And of course, the fantasy that I had was, you get above the cloud line. No matter how rainy or cold or whatever it is down underneath the clouds, above the clouds, it's always perfect. And it's always beautiful. Right? And it's a fantasy to be able to just, of course, everyone has the same fantasy as a child, especially if you're looking at clouds through the plane window. You can imagine yourself just jumping out, and setting up your house, and, your little cloud friends, the whole thing. But it's the ultimate beautiful fantasy, a no place, right? Because of course, if you did jump out of that plane, there's nothing there, right? It's just a surface. Yeah. So that's also there too. That's what brings me also to the paintings as well, right? This idea of, well, what am I painting? Is it something or is it nothing? I'm not sure. Right. So.
I also just wanted to talk about your sculpture a little bit with the two boxes that we see to the right. I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about those sculptures. And I think I can start first with a question. Why did you choose the box-like form?
Amazon Turk.
Oh, like the Amazon box?
Yeah, the Amazon Turk. Right?
Like thinking about the whole system of logistics, again, that kind of undergirds our practice. Yeah.
Yes, but also not. No, I mean, yes.
Yes, but no.
The logistics, you're like exactly right and exactly wrong. No, but yes, of course. I like this idea.
The darker side, of course, because you're also thinking, not just about the labor, but also a very particular, history of discriminatory, racialized history. And I think you can talk.
Yes. But I'm really intrigued by this also. There is so this is just a historical moment. Some people will know this, some people won't. But the Amazon Mechanical Turk itself is named after the Mechanical Turk. I mean, it's one of those things where you're like, really, I can't believe you thought it was okay to call your company Mechanical Turk. It's obviously so. This is an 18th century technology in which there was an animatronic kind of Turk, right? Of course, made by I believe, I'm not sure which Europeans, but so it was a mechanical sort of moving thing that supposedly it would be brought around to fair, this kind of fair grounds of the 18th century. And
you're saying Turk as in the person from Turkey.
Yeah. Well, an interpretation of it in the 18th century by a European. So there's like it's
very
offensive.
Racialized.
Yeah, they're very racialized. But in any case, you would go, and then it was a animatronic machine that supposedly you could play chess with, right? And it was like this magical thing, yeah? But actually what it was, and people kind of knew this eventually, but they still were fascinated by it. It was a box, and there would be like a chess set, and you would come up and you would play with the animatronic Turk. But actually it was a box for a very small man. And there was like a whole mechanisms and levers, and then there was like some magnet system, and they would be playing chess underneath inside this box. Right, so that's the Mechanical Turk, and so that is what Amazon chose to call its data workers after this. Right, so that's where the boxes start.
And in your version of the sculptures, you kind of take that history, this very racialized and very, very kind of offensive history, and you put googly eyes on them. You put animatronic eyes on them. And I want to ask you a little bit about those eyes, and also the voice box that is actually attached to the sculpture. You actually disassembled a sex doll.
I did not personally disassemble it.
You got someone. You got a worker to disassemble a sex doll.
Yes.
And put the parts on there.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you want to explain why you did that?
That's a funny question, actually. I actually started with the eyes. They're animatronic eyes from AliExpress. And I was like, I brought it to a friend who's also a fabricator. And I was like, well, can you do something with this? And he was like, well, I'm basically going to replace every single part. You know this, right? It's no longer going to be the thing you just bought from AliExpress. I was like, that's great. And he was telling me that he was also working on another animatronic eyeballs for another artist. But they had pulled the animatronic eyes from a sex doll, one of those full-scale silicone sex dolls, right? So they'd fished it out of its head. And I was like, well, I know what is going on with sex dolls. They don't just have eyeballs. They often have waste boxes.
But
and I
this
was
one's
like,
not very sexy.
no, well, okay, so I will continue. No, she is. I mean, it depends. She's divested of her body, so it's hard to tell. But so she. So I was like, oh my God, does that mean that you have the voice box? You have the voice chip? Do you have the voice chip? And they were like, yes, we have the voice chip. We just keep it in the office. And I was like, you gonna give me this sex chip? And then and they were like, yes, of course. So I didn't really fish it out. But what I thought was really intriguing about it, particularly, of course, it was a much longer conversation. I'm doing it short shrift. But the interesting thing about the sex doll was that it was a non-Asian sex doll. But they had found it unusable, and this artist had found it unusable because as soon as you had it talk, it very clearly says that it's from Guangdong. And so again, this idea, yeah, and she has a very strong accent, and but again, this idea of like, well, what exactly? Who is inside this box, right? Who's inside that body, always, right? So that is why I also wanted it. Not that it's fun to kind of take a voice-activated sex doll chip, but that in fact it's again the voice of a Chinese woman put inside a different body. Right, and then I will then put it in in a box, but hopefully there's some a resonance there. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it also is interesting that you point out actually in I Am Cloud, you have also this history that you're pointing towards of having all these very invisible labor industries like taking place within very small confined spaces, and it's just another way of actually showing how this dissolution from collective memory happens. And I think that's actually a very strong running thread between The Land at the Bottom of the Sea and also I Am Cloud. It's just how do we reconcile ourselves with these with these populations that are extremely invisible and don't actually have a huge impact on our lives, but are not actually restored to our collective memory. And I like the fact that you open the question, or you open this exhibition with the question of, with The Land at the Bottom of the Sea, asking what happens if you're liquidated, because it's also not just just complete sudden erasure, like in terms of like censorship and that kind of like very strong action, but it's also just this like very slow dissolving, just slowly allowing sort of like the sands of time to take this away from the populations, our collective our collective history. So I actually wanted to ask you a follow-up question, which is you are dealing with some intense histories about exploitation, about marginalization. What is the role of humor in your work? Because your work is not very, it's not very serious, in terms of its tone and affect. I'm just wondering, how you see humor in your work. Like, for example, there are anthropomorphic, like data servers, like in bikinis dancing in the back in your painting. And how do you see humor in your work? Why do you employ it?
Yeah. I'm going to tell a story as a way to answer that. So one of the texts that I was reading, and does show up in the video as well, is a collection of Cantonese rhymes. They're somewhere between songs and very rigidly. If I was better with my Chinese lit, I would know exactly the model, but it's a very particular kind of set of words, right? For each poem, separated by commas. And they were collected. It was 2 collections from 1911 and then 1915. From San Francisco Chinatown in Cantonese. And it was all vernacular. Right, so a lot of recent immigrants writing about, but also the form of these rhymes is that they would be very rigidly formed, but also anonymous, right? So there was no tether to a particular person. So there's a questionable origin, but in any case, we do know they're from 1911 and 1915. So there's a whole section that's about, missing China. There's a whole section that's about, other things, America. And then there's a section that is rhymes from prostitutes in Chinatown. One of the only sources of a direct text from them that aren't related to white missionaries trying to save them and from court cases trying to deport them, right? So one of the things that is but isn't surprising is that a majority of those rhymes are not, oh God, what have I ended up with? This is horrible. I will never be, I will go to hell. Most of them are like,
like I actually think we have one on the
yeah,
slide.
we do.
Like,
we do. It's like,
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. That was it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the visitor is truly a handsome young man. A prostitute sizes him up out of the corner of her eye. The look of a rich young lad, a most pleasing sight. Yeah, she wants to do all the things. So, it's kind of like she invites him to drop by. Indeed, she invites him to drop by, and she doesn't want to pull up her panties. It's like it's so naughty.
Right. It's this, like some of victimhood in a sense. Like
it's just kind of like it is what it is, right? And there's some that are even funnier than this, and not unintentionally so. So my question is always, if I want to index or speak about certain histories, what tonality is appropriate? And is victimhood appropriate? Or is it appropriate to take a more everyday stance and to follow the tenor of what it is that I in fact do find? Right? And of course I find very serious things and I use them in my work, but I also find these things. Right, which is just like, she's a prostitute, but she still likes men. Sometimes she has a good time, right? And in more contemporary parlance, we would say sex work is work, right?
Yeah.
And that doesn't foreclose humanity or humor or enjoyment or any of those things. So it's important that to me at least, as an ethical a point to exemplify that.
Yeah, and I also do want to, sort of preface the fact that your work isn't all rainbows and butterflies. It's not all fun and games because the land at the bottom of the sea is extremely gory, extremely serious, and quite disturbing in some parts. So I think that this is maybe a good place for us to wrap up. And I just wanted to invite the audience, if you have any questions, we can take them.
I noticed that there's like some icons of like memes around, kind of, I don't know, I see this as a Pipi's eyes, which also holds a lot of other meaning strongly in Hong Kong. Sure. And then there's like Clippy, I think Mr. Clippy,
yes,
the favorite Clippy. And I haven't walked around it. Yeah, so I was thinking a little bit about meme culture and like memories, and then of course the cloud as like the collector or the archive of these memes, and what that could mean when it's taken out of context, used in other places, and is it something you're thinking about as well?
Memes? I mean, I do live in the same culture, it's true. So a lot of this kind of flows through unavoidably. But, I like the idea of being able to paint with them, not because it's about memes, but just that it's a simple fact of the visual culture that exists at the point in time in which I'm making the paintings. For sure. And then I'm making, I like this idea, for instance, of Clippy, of doing things like, he's always that sad martyr to virtual office assistants, right? Yeah, the failed AI bot. So he definitely has a place. Yeah.
So, Jen, we talk about or read it somewhere that you once said your videos and film are good at communicating complicated feelings and thoughts, but paintings are visually appealing, they're beautiful and quick to access. How do you see you work with painting and videos and sculpture? How do you see this hierarchy of this different media in your practice?
Sure. It's they have different moments in which they have different relationships to each other at different points in time. But I can say that the paintings are a place that I like to play around with and store ideas related to the videos that I eventually make. Not to say that they're a sketchbook, but it's a good way to kind of get things off of the page and invest images a little bit more than just writing or sketches. I wouldn't have been able to make the video with so much cloud stuff if I hadn't been making paintings with all these cloud things. And then the sculptures, I don't know. I'm not really sure what to say. I don't make so many sculptures, but when I do make them, they seem specific. So I really wanted them to sort of, when we're thinking about people as boxes or people inside structures, it seemed to make sense. And so in this case, it was necessary.
I'd just like to hear a little bit more about your experiences with click working. Like, what was that like for you? How long did you do it?
I did it. I'll be honest. I did do it for the purposes of this project, but I probably dedicated about 20 to 30 hours to it overall, and I have $15 in my account. And it's not because I didn't try really hard. I tried so hard, but it's so much work. And it's any number of things. Again, but it's very clear. Like once you start it, you're like, oh right, I know exactly where this data is going to end up. And so, for instance, you'll hear in the video, there's actually an exchange between a kind of masculine voice and a feminine voice, in which he's talking about, how does it start? Something about him is feeling, I don't know how I feel about this, or something like that. And then the acrostic, can you make me an acrostic poem about nature? But that was actually, I recorded that from one of my clickworking sessions, in which it was trying to test the most natural voice generator. So you had to like keep on listening to these things and listen, and you had to listen through to the very end. It wouldn't pay you unless you listened to the entire end, and it was trying to gauge which female voice you liked better at any point. So it would always be two versions of it, which is why there's two versions, or at least two versions of the thing about, playlist. And again, it was one of those things that took about an hour, and I got paid $2. But this is the structure. It's so unregulated. It's impossible. There's no protections. Yeah. And then other than that, there's still a lot of that old-fashioned data processing. That definitely happens, especially on Mechanical Turk. One of the things that I found really interesting is in speaking to my friends in the social sciences, a lot of them are actually using for human anthropology and sociology studies, they'll also use MTurk. So it's a really cheap, really fast international platform. Yeah, so it's used, it's definitely used in ways that you wouldn't expect, on top of the ways that you would expect.
Like hearing that you engaged in clickwork as research for this project and also some of the materials you shared on the screen, I'd be interested to just hear a bit more about how you engage in research, like which references are you drawing on, where do you go to archives or libraries or mainly online, or where are you kind of looking to sources for research?
Sure. So for this one, I definitely was doing research at the Museum of Chinese in America, of course. So there were many weeks in which I was looking at photocopies of those newspapers from the 18th century, 19th century, lots of New York Times. Not many publications, just the actual articles. And so things like that. I do believe in archive work. Of course, a lot of the work, research and thinking around this did happen at Asia Art Archive in America as well, which I was a resident in this spring. So that was a really nice place in which I got, if less the content of archival content and more a kind of what else can an archive do or institution do to support an artist who is doing archival research. So there was that. So I was kind of bouncing between the two of them. And in terms of the xenobots, a lot of the scientific things like that, I don't end up going to archives because they're contemporary technologies in development. What I will do is I'll find a way to actually meet the scientists. So it happens to be that one of the main people working on the xenobot development is actually in Vermont. So I teach in Vermont, so they're just up the street. So we had a few sessions where we just chit-chatted, you know, that kind of thing. And then what else? What am I forgetting? Yeah, and then the click work. It's just direct act stuff. So yeah. Whatever I can do to get more access and more intimate knowledge of I will do.
Is there some more question?
I think, yeah. Yes. Yeah, I think everyone, yeah. No, thank you. And Jen.
Yeah, thank
yes.
you, Junni. That was.
And thank you to everyone. We're going to wrap up the talk now, and the videos are going to come on, and we can all enjoy the show.